I'll never know. The chords are okay. We usually do 4 songs, we do 3. Okay. That sounds fun? Nope. Yep, I don't leave my room, so. You don't even That's what we all do. We're very lazy at roommates. Like me, I think. I'm incredibly introverted, but I don't I never understood the energy thing. I've heard it explained. I just think incredibly.
Do you feel really, really drained by being around people in general, or because I think?
Okay, so it's less about drain and like filling for me. It's more just how the conversation flows. So for me, I never thought of it in terms of like energy. I always thought of it in terms of like the people. If I don't know them, I don't know what the jokes will work. And for me, comedy is how I like. How I engage with people, probably. And so I don't know people, I don't know comedy, and so I don't know how to like start. So I'll just not say anything. I'm fine like being there, and I don't care. No, I've never thought it that way. I mean, there's a real frustration of like not knowing how to engage. It's the scenarios again because I want to input into the conversation always. But I don't know. It's like I'm just not gonna say anything. I just listen. That's fine.
I just kind of get moved on.
I think me and Nathan are equal with this. Really tough.
Like especially when we're around a bunch of extroverts.
Yeah, I
Well,
get it.
You're a little bit more soft spoken too.
It's hard for me to just shove my way into conversations, and I don't really want to. So if I know people,
Oh my god, you guys actually turned me into That's so beautiful. Now was that winter or young? Oh, I wanted to take out winter. I'm sorry, young.
And it's not really like, oh, if I hang out with my friends like 24
You're the one who's blasting my powers.
No,
You're so
that's
stupid.
not. If I'm just around
Oh, are you young?
You
got
Oh,
never mind. You're not stupid.
I guess that's one.
Yeah, so that's yeah. I don't know. I could literally just do anything forever. I don't know what it is. Like I'm usually the person who wants to leave last and wants to like if there's a game going on that's like social.
Yeah.
I could literally just play it until the end of the time. I don't like have a limit.
But then, so why do you retreat when you live with them?
Because I'm neutral in terms of that benefit. If it's happening,
I'm dealing with this.
I think I value it higher. But again, I don't energy metaphor doesn't really.
Well, I just meant like
So if left to my own devices, I'd probably just be alone forever. I don't know. I just operate really well. So I would say I'm introverted unless I know.
We can someone take away my power for me. Guys, watch out! Yep. Guys, that's not my power anymore. Can I please have it taken?
But then he also
Yeah. Do the
Well,
no.
it depends on how you're measuring it. Because like when you say extroverted, when I think extroverted, the first thing I think of is when you don't know people. How do you operate? Join the fray. The introvert person will stop.
No, he's dead.
Like Cody would be the person who would he gels really well. No, he gels really well with people. When I've seen him meet people he's never met before, he's charismatic and upfront. And I'm just kind of like. I don't know. But like, so I would actually consider him extroverted in that sense. In the sense of like energy, probably introverted.
No,
Which is why I think there needs to be extra like axes. Yeah,
it's not more.
yeah, there just needs to be a
There's professional extrovert, so like this is like
yes.
Oh my god, it's not like I'm very quiet. Like I know how to talk to people and I can talk a lot if needed. Like at school, I think I at school people think I'm extroverted, but I hate like I come home and I feel so much better. Like so much better. And some people they could just do that like all night.
That's true. Yeah.
Right now.
Well, I think it also depends on how you rank yourself socially in the scenario. So like if you are ranked below somebody, like so my example is professors, right? I'm really good at being smart and charismatic when I'm in a professional scenario. But when I'm not in a professional scenario, I feel like I'm an idiot. And like I can't communicate very well. Like some of my master's degree teachers, I would act like a bumbling idiot. It's like, so what's wrong? It's just not working. Did you plug it in? No. That happened all the time. I'm like, what is wrong with me? I can't talk when I talk to these people. And it's just because there's a I lose a lot of my charisma when I'm unsure of myself. And I'm unsure of myself when it's smart to do.
Yeah.
In the specific field of things. Like if I talk to like the president of the United States, the president of the United States who like kind of knows stuff, like I don't think I'd be able to talk.
See, you guys just want to fight a tiny notice Kirby of unlimited
So
power.
everybody relies on how
He comes from the planet, I don't know.
Yeah. So I characterize that as like social hierarchy. Because in that situation, the person at the top of the hierarchy is the one who knows about stuff.
Yeah.
Like talking about Star Wars, no problem. If we're talking about Gone with the Wind, I'm just gonna.
I'm there.
I'm just gonna.
No, Star Wars too.
Force movies, I think all the time movie options.
Here comes Alicia.
I don't know. I'm just saying, like, horse movies, no knowledge. I'm gonna sit this one out.
Engineering.
Math, probability, yeah. Economics. I pretty much gave up recently. I got like I was like starting to get super into politics. I'm like, wait a second. Yeah, I'm not for economics and politics. I was like super, but it's like nowadays they're like half the same. But I like step back and I realized.
Why do you go?
Getting into it, I was like, it's gonna take 3,000. Like I started listening to there's this Marxist. He's like Ukrainian guy. He's like on YouTube makes videos and stuff. Someone's like, he's a Marxist. I'm like, oh, I don't like Marxists. I listen to him. Like, I feel like this guy. He's like, yeah, it makes no sense. Like, why is he wrong? I don't know. And then I went on like I found a couple economy boards on like Reddit. Like economists talk about stuff. I have no idea how economics works. I'm like, I'm just gonna stop. It's gonna take hundreds of years for me to become confident. Like, that's not
You would think, for example, free market is what a liberal democracy.
Well, it's what a classical liberal wants, but not current liberal. Well, so in my research, there's like 4 different main economic schools of thought. There's like Keynesian, Austrian, something else. That is actually what the question is. Because it's saying how much does the government need to regulate the economy? All of it to. And there's arguments far beyond me, but I find it interesting because like reading each of them is like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then reading the next one, like why another one? Oh, that makes sense. And then you get to the last read, all the other ones are wrong. You can't ever get the economy because it's moral bad. It's like that's a good point. They all have really good points. I don't know.
They're like, same level being dead. They're both dead. I love it. It needs to be like ultra instinct strategy. Oh, I thought I was gonna have to like hope I didn't die. Oh my god! No! So bad! No! I'm sorry, my nose was tickling. Oh, that's weird. It always makes an edge. Oh! Oh! Snipe!
So here's the problem for me is it's wrapped up in like there's like water infected. Like
What
to me, I think the Austrian school of economics is the strongest school based on like limited knowledge. Could be wrong, but that school is literally we need anybody to be able to go anywhere they want and do whatever they want, and that's how the economy works. If you want to work and someone wants to pay you, that's what happens. You can't regulate that, you can't stop them, and then that also means no borders. Like you can't have borders, right? So that means the work just comes and fills out next to it.
But even the most democratic nations.
Because that's starting to get towards the end. But again, Austrians want that. However, the problem becomes if you just go like with our economy, you go, you know what? I want just that like Austrian ideal of like anybody can immigrate where they want. The problem is putting that into the entire system where citizenship means taxation and all these other things. And so it's like you want two counter ideals, and you're like, let's do both. Like, I don't know how that works though. So immigration becomes really complicated when you have to consider how it. The easy litmus test is, let's say the government wants to build something, right? It goes through a housing bill. The government actually has the power to forcefully buy them a lot of their homes, right? What that means, which is, I think is very good, it means you don't own anything. You own stuff until, or the government basically allows you to own stuff until they don't want you to own it. Yeah. And then it's up to them to decide what that's worth.
However, you see
yeah, well, there's
dude, I personally like most of it. You guys know if anyone's
oh, okay.
I don't know. I think
I feel like Caitlin was the year so
But again, here's the thing. But see that's like in terms of like law enforcement, which is I'm just talking in general, right? Oh really? Well no, that's fair enough.
No, you.
See that's the thing. If you have the circumstances aligned, whatever those are, you don't own anything. That's like, to me, that's, I don't know, that doesn't seem very good. There's reasons for it. Sure, it's complicated. At a fundamental level, I think that's kind of wrong.
I don't have it.
Oh, yeah.
Buy me something.
Depends on how you.
Buy me something. Come on, get this boy. Buy me something with your
It's crazy, and I don't think anyone's at the level where they can understand it. But also, please, again, I just.
my sister's convinced that they're gonna let someone
Yes, got him! Big guy! Right, buy me something.
because he knows a lot of things. If we let someone super far left, that is that.
Can you donate to Fort Kyle?
Not only my favorite meme is
Come on.
favorite meme. $1,000 a month. One of the presidential candidates on the Democratic side, he's an oddball because all presidential candidates his viewpoints are just all over the board. Yeah, it's not like he's like half Republican, half Democrat. Oh, that's refreshing. I like it. However, he's opponent for universal. Everybody gets $1,000 a month. It's like well, it hasn't to be just as social as we are now. Imagine, right? Imagine that $1,000 a month comes from destroying government like regulation of something, right? Let's say if you leave the military, all that money would be, right? That would be socialist. However, it would be the exact same amount of socialism we have right now. That's what's going to the government, right? However, yeah, so as long as like you shuffle it around, I don't think like you become more socialist. However, the idea of universal basic income is spicy, which may destroy the economy. But we don't care about that. What? What? He doesn't want that. I don't think. He doesn't want college either. He wants universal basic income.
Yes, we got it. Okay, ready, ready, go.
Yeah. So anyways, I think the next race is going to be spicy, but he's won all the memes. Because he went on the internet and it's a game. And all you do is each one tells you that he's wrong, but you chant game until they make you alone. Because all these memes are like all the Trump people. They're like, Trump, like, $1,000 what they're like, game. It's like, which is funny because he's left. And so like, the memers just go to whoever's the funniest. You may advertise Now, you see here, the U.S. has a monopoly on so there's a big incentive for you not to move. Right? This is my problem with taxation on a fundamental level. Is that it's morally wrong because you're taking away from people the influence of ownership. And if you just say, well, why don't you just leave? You go, okay, well, I leave to another country, taxes me. Then, again, the U.S. has a monopoly on where you are right now. And so they also have a monopoly on the use of force. So I understand, like, from a well, think about it, right? Like, so the easiest example, right, is like, let's say I fundamentally morally disagree with the law, right? I don't think you should have to use terms what you're turning unless that's actually needed in the scenario. It's in the middle of the desert. It's like there's nobody around, right? And I turn a corner, and a cop like pops out of the sand and says, "Okay, you're under arrest." They're like, "Take a ticket." I go, "I fundamentally don't agree with this ticket." He goes, "You have to take a ticket." I go, "No, right." At some point, the government must use force. Like I just deny it, right? I'm not going to court. At some point, they need to arrest me because I keep denying it, right? At that point, they are legally allowed to force me to do something that I know for the good of humanity.
The longer the year progresses, the older the voice gets.
But again,
that's how it works.
No. It's the end of the
All I'm saying is that that's probably facts. There's three people on the track, so they're tracking. And you would always kill the one person to save the three. That's what totalitarian. There is a bigger benefit. What you're arguing is that you can violate one person's rights as long as you benefit. Okay, but see, but what you're doing is you're leveraging two value systems, but of human life, right? That's all. Government at a base level advocates for killing some people so that some other people may live, right? So it's just a thought problem. I think it's the most morally reprehensible system in existence, but it seems to work out, and as long as most people are happy, right? As long as a higher number of people are happy, you can do anything you want, right? It doesn't matter how many rights you violate, right? So that's fine. That's all.
My only mission is to always have the big
Okay, but again, you're thinking your value system is still within the bounds of reason, right? You're saying, well, it's bad if we didn't have that, it'd be bad because we would lose more utility in terms of people's well-being. Oh, this is a discussion on like, I think utilitarianism is like a bad thing. But our entire government operates on it. And most people it's like my problem, right? It's like on track, you kill the one person to save three.
I'm arguing that I don't
But that's because your end goal is you want more utility. That's how you value this scenario, right? American government is successful because this many people were happy and this many people were sad. This number's really big, so.
Actually, never mind. I changed my mind. Go ahead. So,
I was waiting for you.
Well, it is to find utility.
It's online.
Right? So Hitler defined utility as the happiness of preserving people for Jews, right? And he values that really high, and the value of the Jews are very low. So he maximizes utility, right? So that's all utilitarianism is. You define it all right, but at the end of the day, you're like, this many people are benefiting, it's greater than this many people who not switched. Yeah. By the truth.
It kind of started as like
Make sure I hit the ball. Make sure I hit the ball.
yes. And the out of 10 that's even shot. It's interesting because of the role of God's mind.
Oh yeah.
So far apart from each other. So bitterly utilitarian. When the original concept was yeah, and that's
okay, well, not always though.
because you're not on the list. If you're not one of the people they care about, then there's no reason to say why. Like it's all about just pushback. And if you're in
Yes.
I'm gonna try to get the dream.
That's very broad. I was just talking about like a government like structure. And obviously it's never going to work. But you can argue perspective, there's probably a range of successful types of science.
the way I've seen it work, just strange history is humans are bad at it.
It's like really
The worst that is on our own government. Like our own almost like a long it's a worse version of the smaller population is the better that's they're still horrible small population.
why?
But what's wrong with being more successful than they're in smaller populations and they're
Sure, but you can say that like if you say US is more successful than like countries less successful.
But see then you have to pick a state.
Yeah. See that's like problem, right?
So bad.
So my personal opinion
I'm
is like
sorry, it's true.
instead of maximizing utility, you should maximize price.
Like, I'm the ultra instinct of the gym.
You try and base it off
So,
of that,
I'm
not how happy people are or how people live.
That's like
Problems. However, I don't know.
So you. Okay, what an aim.
They still have their own little,
in the governance and the people certain space out the little flaws
I wanted to
bigger
say
flaws as there's certain things a lack of feedback loop.
Yeah.
Feedback loop doesn't
That was close. Over there.
It's on the Bible app, man. My quote is everything is the same. Just take the bad game and scratch. My quote was, so yeah, you have to.
I'm serious. I think it's simple. There is no governments, however, everything is relatively the same.
Yes, I got that from Southern Thessalonians.
The rule of money.
You know, it's just that just in the Bible, man.
That's what money is. It's human interaction.
So we need to
I
get him
want something that you have, and you want something I have.
Try to get more people.
Yeah.
What?
If you take that, that
What's the
is
third?
something that is
No!
the base law of existence.
That's why you do.
Trade. You can't really like do anything with that. To me, that's a much more powerful
You gotta love it when they
than the
see
idea
you
that
coming and they
I
go.
lobby some entity or someone to right? There's no universal law that makes that happen, but there's universal law that makes the economy happen. So the idea is you can replace every government structure that exists right now.
Our lyrics are 9,000. You know what I'm
You already have
New game.
right.
Yes.
But
went deeper and jumped on
What's the problem?
Second. Third.
So currency?
yeah,
One of the main arguments is organic capital is impossible before it's banned. And then it's possible because we have technology. Yes. Very interesting.
Alrighty, everybody, let's grab a chair and a Bible.
I can just say that I'm not even touching it, but it's the spicy side.
Holy mission right here. Well, first off, I'm gonna have to make pressing buildings. I live in Magalia.
Oh yeah, I live in the south.
However, there's some really good arguments for that.
Where do you live? Where is Amelia?
You're right in Chapman. Well, actually, it isn't my house. It's my grandma's house.
Oh, okay.
Who's also dead.
Whoa, I got
My grandma's dead too.
my grandma's dead. Wait, no, my grandma.
She call her. See, grandma.
You were like 96. You lived to right old age of 96.
I know.
My dad said he hopes he listens to me.
You know what?
I hope you die.
You know, if I lived to 20, I'd be
My
content.
dad said he'd be content to live to 70.
I would be content if I lived to 40.
You know what? I'll
It breaks down.
Why are we talking about? Okay, guys, I'm calling it. I'm calling it. I'm not going to take it. No, we'll just
The
rally.
argument is
I don't know. It's worth being right.
at the end of the day, they're raised.
What's the brother of soul, right? Because we don't fit into a small nest with
Or if you just like, what goes on in Jennifer's mind?
Settle down, kids.
You just ask kids to settle down.
We are teenagers.
Settle down, kids.
I have taffy in my mouth, excuse me. Taffy?
What?
It's hard to talk.
I think we should invoke a rule that we can start smacking the children.
Well, but that's
I like you.
But we know we're teenagers.
Okay,
There's
settle
a
down,
big
teenagers.
difference.
Alright,
No, there's plenty.
That's just sound.
let's pray. Dear Jesus, thank you for giving us this evening, and thank you for bringing everybody here safely. Lord, I just lift up this night and just worship. Jesus, you're my everything. My heart beats for you. Filled with calm and mystery. Lord, I thirst for you. You are everything. You are everything. Lord, you are beautiful, awesome and wonderful. I give you all my life. Lord, you're the song I sing, perfect in everything. I give you all my life. You are for the sword I rest upon, give you all of my life. Lord, you are beautiful, awesome and wonderful. I give you all of my life. Lord, you are beautiful, awesome and wonderful. I give you all of my life. Lord, you're the song I sing, perfect in everything. I give you all of my life. You guys sing with us? Wonderful, so wonderful, so much you know. Because it's spoken mercy over me. Though I have seen no ear has heard, no heart could fully know. How glorious, how beautiful you are. Beautiful one I love, beautiful one I adore, beautiful one my soul, my heart sings. Powerful, so powerful, the Lord is the sky. Mighty was displayed for all to see. The beauty of your majesty awaits my heart to see. How marvelous, how wonderful you are. Beautiful one, love, beautiful one, I adore, beautiful one, my soul, my heart sings. Open my eyes to your wonders of love. Passion my heart with this love. Nothing on earth is as beautiful as you. And you open my eyes to your wonders of love. Capture my heart with this love. 'Cause nothing on earth is as beautiful as you. My soul, my soul, my sing. My soul, my soul, my sing. My soul, my soul, my sing. Beautiful one, beautiful one. Love, beautiful one. I adore, beautiful one. My soul, my heart sings. Beautiful one, I love. Beautiful one, I adore. Beautiful one, my soul, my heart sings. Light of the world, you step down into darkness. Open my eyes and let me see beauty that made this heart adore you. All the lights went with you. Here I am to worship, here am to bow down. Here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. We are mountains, oh so highly exalted, glorious in heaven above. Humbly you came to the earth you created, all full of shame we can fall. Here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. I'll never know how much it costs to see my sins upon that cross. I'll never know how much it costs to see my sins upon that cross. Here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. Here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me.
Amen.
Thank you,
Oh no.
Daddy.
Jesus in this boy with a loud amen. So it's powerful.
Why is your hair all of a sudden red?
You
Probably.
probably
E-right.
probably got water.
You give me the tag, right? And I unlock it, and it says,
Open your Bibles
"Kiss
up
me on the
to
outside."
Zechariah.
Yeah, the one he gave to me had hearts and said kiss me too.
Wait.
Oh, you're trying to give us Valentine's. Though he threw that to me when I was going to the bathroom.
You ready to see
So.
the orange dresses where you're praising Jesus? You go like this, ready? You just lift your hands the entire time. Haha, squash taffy. Wonder where it's been. Hey, this is my taffy. I gave you one. You did.
Can we get the lights up a little on that side of the room?
That's probably why.
You know, it
What are
was
you doing to me?
I have to get 2 Bibles from Cuneo.
All right.
Perfect. I'm ready.
We're back.
I'll go
Back in Zechariah. Nearly done with this book. Now, as we watch the movie today, you will take note that it is going to change pretty drastically between what we saw last week and what we're seeing this week. The last 2 parts of the book are going to be very different.
9/11, really?
Yeah, those 2 numbers do exist, and they did exist before the year 2001. Did you exist in the year 2001?
Nope.
Yes, my sister did.
I'm not even sure if you have any right to be offended then.
I do.
I'm offended.
All right.
God.
We are nearly done with the book
Why is everyone 14?
of the Minor Prophets. As soon as we finish up Zechariah next week, then all that's left is Malachi. Now, I did add some stuff to our timeline tonight. If you look real hard, you can see the 3 colors of the 70-year period in Babylon. And that's based on what I was talking about a few weeks ago. I don't know if you recall, that it doesn't matter how you measure it, it's 70 years. You can either go from the first person who was taken by the Babylonians all the way measured to the first person who was sent back by the Medo-Persians, or you can take it from the destruction of the temple all the way up to the reconstruction starting of the temple. Either way you measure it, it's still 70 years. So I stuck that on here from the first shading difference to that shading difference, that's 70, and from this shading difference to that shading difference, it's 70. So no matter how you slice it, it's 70. But that needed to be made clear because I added on the Persian Empire. If it looks like they get back here, and yet the Persian Empire started back here, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Just so you guys can see, this is the first time they got back to Israel, and it took all the way up to here before they actually started building the temple, which is a pretty good chunk there, where they were just building their own houses and skipping out on God. During the second half of the Persian Empire, they were at war with the Greco-Macedonian armies, and that is known as the Greco-Persian Wars, and that is critical tonight as we start to look at the prophecies at the end of Zechariah, because Zechariah is writing back here, and the Greco-Persian Wars are up here, and back in Zechariah, the part we read tonight, he names the Greek army before there was a Greek army. It's really cool, because at that point in their history, the Grecians were not a country of connected military might. They were a country of split up city-states. There wasn't a Grecian army at that point, and yet Zechariah is going to mention it tonight, which is really cool because he's talking about stuff that's about to happen in the future. And then, sure enough, you check your history book, and yeah, there was no Grecian army yet. So he mentions the Grecian army before it exists. Pretty cool stuff. This is one of those things where if you read through Daniel, the prophecies are so detailed and so perfectly laid out. And if you read through Zechariah, same deal. They're not vague, they're not mysterious, they're not hard to understand. And they're so perfectly accurate that most non-Christian scholars claim that Daniel and Zechariah were written hundreds of years later than they were, because they got everything too right. And they can't imagine a way for them to get things right other than write about it after the fact. They can't imagine God telling these guys that happened in advance. Yeah.
So by any chance, do they talk about Alexander?
Not in Zechariah, no. They do not name Alexander. If you do go to the book of Daniel, though, it talks about how he only rules for a short time, and then he dies, and then his kingdom gets split into four, given to his four generals.
And then
it goes into that much detail.
And then like one of those harder parts just takes all of India,
You know how it is. So yeah, crazy times. But yeah, Daniel goes into even more detail, but it's a longer book. He has room to go into more detail. Plus, he just has more fun visions, I think. Zechariah's are like, pretend to be a shepherd. Okay, now be worse at it. And like that's like the visions he's given. It's not quite as much fun as like giant statues and crazy beasts and things. So, all right. Any other questions before we move on? No. All right.
You forced him to give me my big Bible.
Oh.
Do it, Daniel.
You had to make up with two big.
Do it.
Stole
He's in
the
7th grade. He's in 8th grade. He needs the big Bible.
Yeah, right. So
Yeah.
He's a year older.
Bryce
His
is
eyes
his
don't work
elder.
the same.
He needs
They don't work the
Bryce
same.
needs a big Bible because he's wearing glasses.
Now,
he can't
now
see.
Bryce has
Whoa,
two eyes,
holy
and he has
moly.
two Bibles.
Everyone's like so far away.
If he uses one Bible for each eye, does that make it easier to read? That's you can do it in 3D. Like if you move one Bible away from the side,
I got that.
I have 2 Bibles now. I'm okay, but
You're
I
like
mean,
one of those
you
3D
could
puzzles.
always.
all right, guys, we're gonna watch a video
Give me a couple hours.
to get ourselves reacquainted with the Book of Zechariah since we took a week off.
That says this.
Here we go. Let's do
The book of the prophet Zechariah. The book is set after the return of the exiles from Babylon to Jerusalem, and we're told in the book of Ezra that Zechariah and Haggai together challenged and motivated the people to rebuild the temple and look for the fulfillment of God's promises. Now, long ago, Jeremiah the prophet had said that Israel's exile would last for 70 years, and that afterwards God would restore his presence to a new temple and bring his kingdom and the rule of the Messiah over all nations. The dates at the beginning of this book tell us that those 70 years are almost up. But life back in the land was hard, and it seemed like none of these promises were going to come true. Why? And the book of Zechariah offers an explanation. It has a fairly clear design. There's an introduction which sets the tone for a large collection of Zechariah's dream visions, and that's concluded by chapters 7 and 8. And then this is followed by two more large collections of poetry and prophecy. Let's just dive in and see how the book works. It begins with Zechariah's challenge to his generation to turn back to God and not be like their ancestors who rebelled and refused to listen to the earlier prophets, which landed them in exile. And so now the returned exiles respond positively to Zechariah. They repent and humble themselves before God, or so it seems. The next large section is a collection of 8 nighttime visions that Zechariah experienced. And just to prepare you, these are full of very bizarre, strange images, a lot like your dreams. The idea that God communicates to people through symbolic dreams, it's very old. It goes back to the book of Genesis. The dreams of Jacob or Joseph or Pharaoh, these gave meaning to current events at the time, but they also gave a window into the future. And so Zechariah has his own dreams now, and they've been arranged in this really cool symmetrical design. The first and the last visions are about 4 horsemen each. They're like rangers patrolling the world on God's behalf, and it's a representation of God's attentive watch over the nations. Their report is that the world is at peace. And in Zechariah's day, this refers to how God raised up Persia to conquer Babylon and bring peace. And so the question now arises, the 70 years of Israel's exile are almost up. Is now the time for the Messianic kingdom in Jerusalem? And God responds by saying that he's determined to fulfill those promises, but he leaves the question of timing unanswered. The second and seventh visions are paired because they're both reflections on Israel's past sin that led up to the exile. So the second vision is about these horns that symbolize the nations that attacked and then scattered Israel, Assyria and Babylon. But then these horns or empires are themselves scattered by a group of blacksmiths, an image for Persia. The seventh dream is about a woman in a basket, and we're told that she's a symbol of the centuries of Israel's covenant rebellion. And then this woman is carried off to Babylon by other women who carry the basket flying with stork wings. This is so strange. The third and sixth visions are paired as they're both about the rebuilding of a new Jerusalem. So a man is measuring the city. It's an image of God's promise that Jerusalem will be rebuilt and become a beacon to the nations who will join God's people in worship. And then the sixth dream is about a scroll that flies around the New Jerusalem, punishing thieves and liars. The idea being that the New Jerusalem is a place that's purified from sin by the scriptures. The fourth and fifth visions are at the center of this collection, and they're about the 2 key leaders among the returned exiles. So Joshua, the high priest, and then Zerubbabel, the royal descendant of David. So Joshua had been symbolically wearing Israel's sin in the form of these dirty clothes. But then those are taken off, and he's given new clothes and a new turban, a symbol of God's grace and forgiveness. And then an angel tells Joshua that if he remains faithful to God, he will lead his people, and Joshua will become a symbol of the future Messianic king. The other vision is about 2 olive trees that supply oil to this elaborate gold lamp, which itself is a symbol of God's watchful eye over his people. And these 2 trees symbolize the 2 anointed leaders, Joshua and then Zerubbabel, who's leading the temple rebuilding efforts. And God says that success will not come to this new temple if it's the result only of political maneuvering. Rather, these 2 leaders must be dependent upon the work of God's Spirit. The visions come to a close with a bonus vision from the prophet, and it picks up the themes of the central 4th and 5th visions. It's Joshua, the high priest again, and he's given a crown and presented as a symbol of the future Messiah, who will also be a priest over God's kingdom. And then Zechariah closes it all out, saying that all of these visions will be fulfilled only if the current generation is faithful to God and obeys the terms of the covenant. And so altogether, these 3 visions emphasize how the coming of the Messianic kingdom is conditional upon this generation being faithful to God. Which leads to the conclusion of the dreams. It's another challenge from Zechariah, and a group of Israelites come, and they've been mourning over the former temple's destruction for nearly 70 years. And they ask him, is it time to stop grieving? I mean, is God's kingdom going to come very soon? And Zechariah again reminds them of how their ancestors rejected God's call through the prophets, which led to the exile. And so he challenges them too. He says, this generation will see the Messianic kingdom only if they pursue justice and peace and remain faithful to the covenant. So in other words, Zechariah reverses their question. He asks, are you going to become the kind of people who are ready to receive and participate in God's coming kingdom? And that question is left just hanging there. The people don't answer, and the book just moves on. And so we come to the final sections that are very different from chapters 1 to 8. Each section is a kaleidoscopic collage of poems and images about the future Messianic kingdom. So the first one, chapters 9 to 11, describe the coming of the humble Messianic king who's riding a donkey into the New Jerusalem to establish God's kingdom over the nations. But then, all of a sudden, this king, he's symbolized as a shepherd over the flock of Israel, and then he's rejected. First by his own people, but then also by their leaders, who are also symbolized as shepherds. And so God hands Israel over to these corrupt shepherds. And it raises the question, will Israel's rejection of their king last forever?
Done. We've seen this video so many times. Why do we keep watching them?
Because each time we stop at a different
We always
point,
watch
because
it a little bit
It's
more.
funny to watch how you
We always
guys
do.
just-
Oh wait, I guess I shouldn't shut
Is
that.
it over now?
Did that sound like an ending?
You get some of those really thin wire glasses. Oh wow. Guess what price
Boom. Okay, so we're gonna break into some small groups.
I know what you
Ladies, you actually have 2 girl leaders tonight. Quite impressive. Boys, you got 2 leaders as well.
Okay,
And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 9. Okay, 9 guys. So we got a group of 4, a group of 5.
okay, that's 4.
You guys seem pretty happy about that. Okay.
No, because Daniel, we'll get Daniel.
What can we have there?
Zane, who do you want? Do you want the older boys or the younger boys?
I want things fun, but Zane can handle all of those.
yeah, I think it requires.
Nathan, it's not about him. It's about you. Are you gonna listen to him?
Yes. Yes.
That seems to
Don't
not
care.
be the truth.
Don't care. You want Zane? Alright, cool. Younger guys, anyone who's not 8th grade, you can have Zane apparently. Caleb has spoken for you.
Couch.
Couch.
I'm just kidding. I'll couch. Couch.
Too late, Jonathan got there first. Nathan! Jonathan got there first.
That's mainly the girls.
Gotta be nicer to Jonathan.
Wait, everyone gets super close to Daniel. Like
Oh.
we usually do.
Hey Jonathan, Zane's not leading.
Oh, we're gonna go on the couches. Let's no ladies.
Couches.
I was just gonna sit over here, guys. Just gonna sit over here.
Hey man, I'm already here. I'm not
Just gonna sit
moving.
over here.
Come on, let's form a cult around Daniel. A cult? Daniel. I love this. It's so hard to hold 2 Bibles.
It's too late. She left without you.
Nobody's in there. Nobody's in
I don't know.
I guess Nate's gonna steal it.
Got him. I made it to where the girls can sit at that place either.
That's me.
You're just making that up as if it was your goal.
It literally was my goal. I told Alex to say it.
You can just say that. You're mean.
No.
Yeah, I'm saying that
I
because
would have
I'm-
given the couch to the girls some night.
I wouldn't know.
I would have.
I'm there after.
I would have given some.
They think you're over there right now, all of you.
Make sure I knock that.
No, Nathan, no.
When you're shorter than someone else,
Gotta
I
be
don't
better
think
than
you
that.
should be considered their elder anymore.
I'm taller than all those girls over there.
No, I think you might be
Yeah.
taller than one of those girls.
Yeah, you're
No,
taller
I'm
than
taller.
William.
Yeah, you're taller than
You're
Alexis.
Samara too?
Yes.
You're
Okay.
taller
No,
than
Samara's
William.
taller than
I
you.
didn't
No,
think you were
Samara
taller.
is
I
taller
think
than
so.
you.
Samara's pretty
We're
tall.
tiny.
Samara's taller than me, and I'm taller than me.
Yeah. I'm taller than Alex.
It's okay,
Samara's
it's
the
okay.
old.
Junior
I'm
high is the
something.
prime time for the
Yeah,
girls to
but
shoot
I'm
past
older
the height.
because I'm 13. They're
Doesn't
all
matter.
younger.
I'm
Doesn't
14.
matter. Doesn't matter. Okay.
You think I care?
Chapter 9. He does care.
Yeah.
You,
Alright.
you might be
Who's
the
reading
elder,
chapter 9?
but I'm
There's
your
only 2 verses.
authority.
Oh no.
Who wants 2 verses
Got
only?
it.
I do.
Me?
Okay,
No,
Alex, you
what
got 2
the heck?
verses.
Okay, 9 through 10.
9 through 10.
He comes in at the very
They're
end.
gonna be
Hey Jeremiah, how's it going? Pick a group to join.
Dude, my sister has that bag. Daniel's gonna need help with us.
No.
Read, Alex.
Okay. Okay. Rejoice, O people of Zion. Shout and triumph, O people of Jerusalem. Look, the king is coming to you. He is righteous and victorious. Yet he is humble, riding on a donkey. Riding on a donkey. I will remove the battle chariots of Israel and the war horses from Jerusalem. I will destroy all the waves in battle, and your king will Sounds like me.
I will always remember the name of the Euphrates River because of my history teacher. One time he made us listen to a rap about the Euphrates River.
Really?
It is burned into
Oh
my
my gosh,
mind.
I heard a rap about triangles.
Oh my gosh, it was
Oh
terrible.
my
We had the
gosh.
same math class. She loves raps about math.
Oh my gosh, it's the worst because
Makes
he
your
raps
ears
about
bleed.
like the isosceles, the scalene, the obtuse, and it's just bad. It's like,
Does it have anything to do with this passage?
yes,
This
it
is
has
what
everything to
said?
do because this book is obviously trash.
Hey, so what do you guys think about this king he's talking about? Who's this remind you of?
Sounds like the Illuminati.
Sounds like someone.
Yeah.
Like Nora. We just bought the Blu-ray Hobbits. We just got done watching it. My mom
Finally, it's
got
about time.
The Lord of the Rings of the Hobbit. For
I mean,
herself.
Jesus, because there's never been a world.
No, that sounds like the Holy
That's a good
Spirit
point.
right there.
Yeah.
I definitely think it sounds like Jesus because it says he is righteous and victorious, yet he is humble riding on a donkey. And I
Oh,
think
he
that
rides
sounds a
on a
lot like what Jesus does because he did ride on a donkey too. I mean, we wouldn't even need that. We just need the righteous, victorious, and humble part. 'Cause, I mean, he is that, but he's also very humble.
I gotta say something. I like how everyone's saying, I think it's Jesus, even though the obvious answer is Jesus.
Yeah,
There's no
it's obvious.
other person who did this. So it's like, well, I think it sort of matches to be Jesus. It is
Did you
Jesus.
forget the Bible?
And then it would be so great if it's not Jesus. You sound like an idiot.
You guys brought in the whole C2C kingdom. You brought in the donkey. What about the get rid of war horses, get rid of battle chariots, destroy weapons,
He talks about
and
that.
bring
It
peace?
talks about that in Revelation. When Jesus comes back, it talks about that in Revelation.
Oh,
He's
he'll
gonna
bring
come
peace,
riding
yeah,
a white horse, and he's just gonna destroy everybody.
He's gonna T-pose on them all.
He's gonna-
I feel like you're almost there, and then
Holy
you like
Okay,
you veered off
the
course
memes
all
will
of a
be
sudden.
afterwards. But he's gonna destroy them with a word, and then afterwards,
There's
when
some memes
everyone's
already.
when everyone's down,
I
he's
just don't
gonna
think Jesus will be. I just don't think Jesus will be
Sorry,
using.
it's all the dead
wait, no,
memes.
because he does that, it turns into a there's like a meme photographer there ready for him to say it. Just so he can snap the shot.
Someone later finds
shot,
the camera
and
because that guy died.
Wait,
No, it's gonna be an angel. It's gonna be an angel.
Oh.
So
No, his army of dead people is the dead memes.
What?
this example of dead memes, live memes.
All right, so interesting. It says your king, he, and then in verse 10 it says I. It doesn't say he will. It says I will. Did you guys catch that?
So it means that, well, he's a prophet, so he speaks from what God tells him.
Interesting, very interesting. Because sometimes when you're reading a prophetic book and it says I, it is the prophet speaking. It's his perspective. It's his opinion. It's his feeling. It's his, speech. Other times in a prophet's writing, you'll read I, and it's God talking. And so the I means God. So you actually have to kind of double check. You have to figure out which I is God, which I is the prophet. Because later in the book, it's very clear the I is the prophet. But some of the times in here, it's not the prophet, it's God. Does anyone know how you can tell the difference?
Well,
Say again?
a lot
Like when it says I, how do you know if it's a prophet or if it's God? Like who's the
because God
who's the
sounds
God?
way more intelligent.
Because by context, it says he in capitals, and then it says his realm. So but what about on both sides of these? On both sides of the I?
No, keep in mind those are the beginnings of sentences.
Yeah.
In this particular translation, they're not capitalizing his on purpose, because in the middle of verse 9, or towards the end, it says he is humble and it's a lowercase h. So it's not being honorific. Honorific is where you attach a meaning to the way you refer to someone. So in this case, there isn't one. It's not a he that's specific. It's just the regular old pronoun.
Well, I feel like
I'm not saying you're wrong on who it is. I'm
Yeah.
just saying you don't take the capital H as like a automatic slam dunk. It's Jesus. So in this particular passage, the way you can tell who the I is to go all the way back up to chapter 9, verse 1, and see the intro. He says, "This is the message from the Lord." Blah blah blah. Then you have a formatting shift. You have poetic format. So notice the paragraph indent on verse 1, everything is flatlined on the side, and then notice the indenting on this, where it's every line has its own separate indent to show you when he's moved on to a new line. So this is a poetic representation of words from God. And you'll notice it ends over here at the end of the chapter, and then you have a new one start up, and he goes back into poetic form. And then that one ends right here, in verse 4 of chapter 11, and that goes almost to the end of chapter 11, but then there's like one little verse there at the end. It's like a poetic quote. And so you can see which ones are quotes, where God's talking,
Yeah.
and then you can see which ones are him, the prophet, talking. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And usually though, you could also tell because it doesn't have any paragraph form. They're just put this way because even when it does say show when Zechariah is talking, like in this area,
Yeah.
it still has little paragraphs in between.
Totally.
But this one just goes
Right, every
straight
line is its own paragraph. And some lines are less than a sentence. Some lines will literally be a half or a third of a sentence, and it's still its own like line. Now, in other parts of the Bible, if it's not a prophet, that could just mean it's a song. Like that kind of formatting could just mean literally gone from speaking to singing. In other parts of the Bible, it might be a reference to an old verse. Like if you're in the New Testament and you see that formatting, it might be Paul quoting some Old Testament verse, and that's all it means. So this formatting is not a consistent, it's always God talking formatting. It's this is different from the other thing. Or it's a quote. That's a very frequent use of this. But yeah, sometimes it's just a song. It has nothing to do with anything. But in this particular instance, we know based on the opening at chapter 9, verse 1, this is a quote. So when it says he, talking about we've decided it's Jesus, you guys have gone with that evidence. I like that. And then when it says I, then it's back to God. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it says, I will remove the battle chariots from Israel and the war horses from Jerusalem. I will destroy all the weapons used in battle, and your king, back to Jesus, will bring peace to the nations.
That's God talking about Jesus and like that.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So his realm will stretch from sea to sea and from the Euphrates River to the ends of the earth. So some of the things God does, some of the things Jesus does. There's different parts to play in this unfolding of the story. The other thing to think about too is that like the donkey part, that's not second coming.
Yeah, that's true.
That's
This is
first
both
coming.
first coming and second coming I was talking about.
But notice some of the things in this part we would normally call second coming, like the battle chariots, the war horses, the weapons. It doesn't say whose, it just says where.
Yeah.
And so this is one of those prophecies that has that minor fulfillment, major fulfillment. And if you look at the minor fulfillment, it's essentially that Jerusalem and Israel don't get to have an army. That's the minor fulfillment.
Oh,
He says all the things will be gone from Jerusalem. So that's not actually a positive thing inherently. That's not an automatically good thing.
How did the people take it?
Well, I think based on what we see in the Apostles, since we've been going through Mark on Sundays, I think they took it to all mean second coming type interpretation. Like a flatten the world, peace on earth, because Jesus is in charge.
That's why they were confused. That's why like when we were talking on Sundays in Mark, like how the apostles just completely thought it was second coming. They were like, I'll be first.
I want to be your
you're
general.
second hand man.
Yeah.
He'll be your third because
I read that again, but in Matthew, it's second coming.
yeah, but I'm authority.
Have you got to the part where their mom comes and asks? Oh my gosh, that's my favorite one. Where their mom goes to Jesus and says, "Hey, hook my boys up."
That was so funny. I was like, Mom, why?
Mom, stop it. I love that part. Okay, so
Hold on, I got
Go for
something real quick. They don't put quotation marks around.
correct.
Okay. I was gonna say
Correct.
that, but I was saying like Jesus.
I was trying to say that the entire time.
God talking, but
I couldn't.
the quotations. I was
Yeah.
confused.
Some translations are really big on quotations. Other translations are not really big on
And if
quotations.
I would have got it wrong, Nathan would give me heck about it.
And there's different parts where you'll actually find them even in this translation. If you go back to verse 23, you'll see 23 is all in quotes, and then back to 20. 20 is in quotes down to I don't know where it is, but like somewhere around there. And then they re-quote in the middle of 21. So like they'll use quotes in this translation, but in this particular one, I think he's given this as like a proclamation, and he probably wrote it down separate. And so he's like doing his own self-referential quote, like recopying from a scroll. He probably went out and read in public.
Hold on, I gotta say something.
Go
I
on.
just glanced over and I saw that on chapter 12 in verse 12, it says the clan of David will mourn alone, as will the clan of Nathan. You see that?
That's important stuff. It's important stuff. Okay, who wants to read the next section?
Yeah, and
Chapter 9, verses 11 to the bottom.
I'll read it. I got my own channel.
Okay, guys, read along. Chapter 9, verse 11.
Got it. I'll do it.
The covenant I made with you seals of blood. I will bring you prisoners from death and the waters of this dungeon. Come back to the place of safety, all you prisoners who still have hope. I promise this very day that I will repay 2 blessings for each of your troubles. Judah is my bow, and Israel is my arrow. Jerusalem is my sword, and like a warrior I will brandish it against the foes. The Lord will appear above his people, and his arrows will fly like lightning. The sovereign Lord will sound the ramjet and attack the gates from the southern desert. The Lord of heaven's armies will protect his people, and they will defeat their enemies utterly with slaves. They will shout in battle as though drunk with wine. They will be filled with blood like a bowl. Drenched with blood like the corners of the altar. On that day, the Lord their God will rescue his people, just as a shepherd rescues the sheep. They will sparkle in his sun like jewels in a crown. How wonderful and beautiful they will be. The young men will thrive on abundant grain.
Young women, Bryce, it's women.
That's the second part, man.
Yeah, I was.
You misread.
The young woman will flourish on new land.
Oh.
He read the first part first. You read
I
the
hate
second
to
part
keep
first.
comparing this to
okay.
The Hobbit, but this sounds like what the orcs did.
Green and black?
Dude, can you get out of the Hobbit world?
The
You
part
just
before
watched
it.
it.
Yeah, I did just watch it. Yeah.
Do you realize how many times I watched the Hobbit?
Alright, guys.
I've watched it like
I've never seen the Hobbit.
20 times.
The book's better. Like,
The book
like,
is way better.
I've read
the book.
You gotta love the book,
There's so
man.
many times where the book is better than the movie, but I don't think it's ever been truer than with the Hobbit.
I've never seen Lord of the Rings.
Oh, Percy Jackson.
The Lord of the Rings movies, I like the Lord of the Rings movies. But I think Peter Jackson just got kind of drunk on 3D. And then he adds in like so much extra random junk, and the pacing's all off. I just could go on.
Desolation of Smile.
It really hurts. It's terrible. Okay, so
I don't know. I
do
thought it
you
was pretty
think
bad.
in these verses? Do you think in these verses at the end of chapter 9 that we're talking about Israel's past, Israel's future, or a little bit of both?
Neither.
And then like,
All of the above.
what do you think, Jade?
I think.
Okay, can you see which is which? Is it possible to see?
Well, I read in verse 16. Or wait. It says on verse 16. It says on that day the Lord God will rescue his people, and I mean just reading that from a grammar view. It says present, future tense.
Oh, there you go.
So,
I think it's present. I think it's talking
I
about
think
right
it's
now.
future, but I mean, if you look, it's always will.
You have the same question.
You don't
for
just
the third
Dude, what is
question.
it with you and Will?
That's intentional.
Oh, okay.
Because we'll have read a different passage.
Yeah, they don't just say like, oh, they did this, they did this. It's always like, they will do this, they will do this.
Okay. So there's a little bit of disagreement between scholars on this part, but if you start to look at it with the paragraph breaks, if you start to look at it when he introduces like different names of people, then it feels a little bit like the both. So 11 and 12, he says, because this covenant I made with you seal with blood, I will free your prisoners from death in a waterless dungeon. So the dryness thing and the prisoners thing doesn't really happen again in the near term for them. Like if you go into their near future, it never really happens. So him rescuing them isn't something that matches up with the rest of the timetable, especially since he mentions the Greeks. If he mentions the Greeks, then you're kind of locked into a timetable. They're not really a conquering army today, but they were at a certain point in history. So like you kind of have to narrow in and see if it works there. But they did just come out of being prisoners. Like they literally just came out of being prisoners in Babylon. It was like that year, but you know. So if that's the case, people tend to look at this passage as like starting out where they're at, and then going further into their future the more he keeps talking. Does that make sense? So rather than it being like this point in time, all of it, or the future, all of it, it's like, let me tell you how it's going to go. And he starts where they're at, and so that kind of makes sense. The first thing he mentions is what they're just getting done with. And then it just keeps on stretching out in front of them. Because then he gets onto the Greeks, and then it just keeps on going. Heaven's armies, loud trump, you're going to get your land back, God's going to rescue you, and eventually Israel will be wonderful and beautiful. And that's like the end of it. So like he goes through the whole gamut of Israel's life from that point in history all the way up to the end of history. That's how I take it. I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it is intentional.
Actually, I have a question.
Yeah.
Can I do the next one?
Wait, no, I have a question.
Go ahead,
No,
Jake.
I have a question for Nathan. Why is your hair wet? I just noticed it.
It's in the
bothering
back.
me.
Because I
It's in the back
splashed
as
my
well.
face with water so I could wake up.
It's good.
Oh.
It's good. I like that. Alright, who wants to read
Me,
chapter 10?
me.
It's like all of 10 and then 3 out of chapter 11.
Got it.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah, I can go potty.
Start at first one. Got it. Okay. Ask the Lord for rain in the spring, for he makes the storm clouds. He will send showers of rain, so every field becomes a lush pasture. Household gods give worthless advice. Fortune tellers predict only lies. And interpreters of dreams pronounce falsehoods that give no comfort. So my people are wandering like lost sheep. They are attacked because they have no shepherd. Man, you can make so many memes from what God roasts people. These are the first memes ever. We're looking
The
at
minor
memes
prophets
that
are
happened
rife with
thousands
these
of years ago.
roasts. It is not an uncommon thing to see someone get thoroughly trashed.
Yes. My anger burns against your shepherds, and I will punish their shepherds, for the Lord of heaven's armies has arrived.
Just read what's on the page.
To look after Judah and his flock. He will make them strong and glorious. They get proud war horse in battle. From Judah will come the cornerstone, the peg, the bow for battle, and all the warriors. They will be like mighty warriors in battle, trampling their enemies in the bottom of their feet. Since the Lord is with them as they fight, they will overthrow even the enemy's horses. I will strengthen Judah and save Israel. I will restore them because of my power. It will be as though I had never rejected them. For I am the Lord their God who will hear their cries. People of Israel become like mighty warriors, and their hearts will be happy as by water. It's like blind.
No, I think what he's talking about is like the over exuberance you get when someone is drunk. So he's talking like not just like, oh yeah, no, I'm happy, but like like coming undone.
Like little children. Like
Yes, that kind of happy. It's a lot like that.
Yes. Okay. Their children too will see it and be glad. Their hearts will rejoice in the Lord. They will cross the street. They will come running and flock for I have redeemed them from the few who are left. They will grow as numerous as they were before. Though I have scattered them like seeds among the nations, they will still remain flossy.
No.
They will remember.
Nathan's gonna get struck down.
Keep over there. I don't get it.
God loves flossing.
Hey, when you get struck out, keep over there.
He doesn't say that.
I can just imagine the angels up there just all
They can move over, okay? Then when God strikes you down, I don't want to actually get him.
But I'll hold you so that the electrocution will go through me into you, and you will take the pain. As will I. That's how it works. Like a boss.
Tell me something, Nathan. Do you floss your teeth?
Yeah.
In the street.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I dress up in a tooth costume and I just floss in the street. Or if my doctor dentist tells me, so have you been flossing? I'll be like, of course I've been flossing. Who hasn't?
Alright, let's go for it.
They and their children will serve and return.
Survive.
It's the same thing. And return again to Israel.
Okay.
I'm just gonna leave
Agree to
it.
disagree.
I will bring them back from Egypt and gather them from Assyria. I will wrestle them and no wrestle.
Wrestle. Does not say I will wrestle.
Wrestle them.
Nope.
I will wrestle them and
Nope.
I will
Resettle.
resettle their wrestling.
Nope.
I will resettle them in Galilee and Lebanon while wrestling
Nope.
until there's no more room for them all. They will pass safely through the sea of distress. The waves of the sea will be held back. The waters of the Nile will dry up and then burn to death.
Nope.
The pride of Assyria will be crushed, and the rule of Egypt will end by my crossing.
Nope.
By my power, I will make my people strong, and by my authority, they will go wherever they wish. I, the Lord, have taught.
Nope.
Nobody.
How about we switch readers? Nobody.
Yeah,
There's 3 verses left. Maybe that's on read Jeremiah.
Open your doors.
Jeremiah, why don't you read the last 3 verses?
Set that
Okay.
fire. Set
Open
that
your
fire
doors,
to devour
Lebanon,
your
so that-
cedar forest.
Nathan.
You've been vanquished.
You've been terrible.
Sorry.
You're absolutely terrible. I gotta admit.
Open your
Jesus
doors,
loves
Lebanon,
us all.
so that fire may devour your cedar forests. Weep, you cypress trees, for all the ruined cedars. The most majestic ones have fallen. Weep, you oaks of Bashan, for the thick forests have been cut down. Listen to the wailing of the shepherds, for their rich pastures are destroyed. Hear the young lions roaring, for their thickets in the Jordan Valley.
Thank you. All right, Jaden. Do you think that section is telling of Israel's
Yes.
present, future, or
Okay, well, if you guys
maybe
look
their
through
past?
Ecclesiastes 1-2, we will know that it is both.
Please. Okay, let's go there. Let's go there.
I have a belly.
I don't know. All I really got from it was Flossie in the street.
Yeah, I could
This
have
time,
I got
Nathan,
This is
wasted.
This is
all
why
that
we
time.
don't let Nathan be.
Nathan, all that time is gone now. We can't have it back.
It's Flossie, man. No
This is
time.
why we don't let him read.
Ecclesiastes 4. Hold on. I'm checking his. Ecclesiastes 4.
No,
verse
1, 2.
2. No, you
I
said
thought it
4.
was Ezekiel 8.
No, it was Ecclesiastes 1.
Okay, Ecclesiastes 1-2. Everything is meaningless. Meaningless.
Have you never read Ecclesiastes?
No, I memorized that verse, and that's why I said that earlier too. I was just waiting. No, I was reading Ecclesiastes like 3 days ago, and I read that, and I was like,
Oh, I figured out a
Bless
way
you.
to do orange justice where you're
No.
praising Jesus.
No.
You do it. Ready?
All of the no.
No,
Do
you
you
go
not
like this.
understand how much no?
You just praise him. You know, you're just.
Nathan, look at me. Do I seem like I care?
Look at
about
that.
Jesus does though.
So okay, so I will.
It says it in Ecclesiastes.
okay, you
I
know,
think it says it really well
we
in
will
Ecclesiastes.
we will take this moment. Jesus was the first
So,
tea poster.
is there anything that anyone got out of that section?
Yeah,
that we
Yes.
read?
It's future.
Jesus
You
loves
feel like it's
soft.
future. What
Yeah,
felt future to you?
Like, when
Shh, Nathan, you're about to get kicked out.
I will bring them back to Egypt and gather them from Assyria. Just the way he says it.
Okay.
And to me, it just kind of
The way I said it.
the way it always says is.
He didn't.
No, actually, no, because here it says, "My anger burns against your shepherds, and I will punish these leaders."
Will.
So
Hasn't done it yet.
that's the thing. It seems like it's
You
talking about the
slacking.
future, but also he does say that his anger burns against the shepherds,
Which means that it can be put out with water.
so it's pretty much the future. Because
In this case, it is actually a mixture of the present and the future.
Haha, got him.
So what we've got going on here is an instance that God's talking about, and He doesn't specify when it is exactly, but it's an instance where people are believing in superstition as well as Him, and they have leaders who don't just allow this; they're supporting it. That there is superstitious stuff and worship of God happening both at once. This already happened. They were already punished for it, and God brought them back out of it.
Yeah.
And yet, if we keep watching Israel, because this was all the way, 500 BC, if we keep watching them, it happens again. And arguments could be made that it's still happening. So,
like the paranormal.
well, specific to Israel, though, not just like generally God's creation, but specific to Israel. And then what does God say? He says he's going to bring them back from, and he lists the places. Now the places are interesting because he says Egypt. Egypt is symbolic of the place you go when you want to get away from God willingly. You decide to walk off from God. And Assyria is symbolic of what happens to you as a consequence of walking off from God. So Egypt is the place when you're far away from God by your own decision, and Assyria is the place where you're far away from God by consequence, as punishment for your decisions. So he's going to rescue them from both Egypt, he says, and Assyria. So it's kind of like, no matter where you end up, Israel, no matter how far away from me you get, I'll pull you back. I'll rescue you. I'll bring you back. And it's going to be good. And then he says, the pride of Assyria will be crushed, and the rule of Egypt will end. And that is, again, symbolic of the I don't want to turn back to God pride. The Assyrian pride would be the pride of, you know what? I'm getting punished and I just hate God even more. I'm still there. And the other one, the rule of Egypt, is when sin has control over you. You go into your sin so hardcore, you lose control over yourself. And your sin is driving the show. Yeah.
Okay. I just gotta say that when it talks about how household gods could work as advice,
Yeah.
and then it just roasts more about fortune tellers, predicting lies, and interpreters of dreams, pronounce falsehoods that give no comfort.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, that's just, he just roasted everybody who wastes their money on people who have a glass ball. They just wasted their money.
Well, not only that, but he says the final part is they're lost. All those things that like they think lead them, like, oh, I can tell the future by this crystal ball, or oh, I think I can get advice out of this statue, or oh, I was the last one.
How would a statue give you
I had a
advice?
weird dream, and I'm gonna pay some guy to tell me what it means.
No, when I look at a crystal ball, I see someone ugly. Alex gets it.
I like how Keaton says Alex gets it and everyone else laughs.
Everyone got it.
Yeah, well, Alex, like, his laugh was enthusiastic.
Even though really on the inside he didn't actually know what the hell.
He just wants me to feel better.
I can get a joke and still not laugh at it. It's just, when the joke is.
I thought all the jokes are kind of
All right. So between the two sections, because we talked about chapter 9 and we talked about chapter 10 and that little smidge of 11. Between the two, God's laying out not only where they've been, where they're at, but also where they're going, and in it he shows consistency. He's consistent in all these situations. He's the one who waits patiently for them to wake up. He's the one who rescues them. Once they've woken up, he's the one who gives them the law of the land, and here's how you should live to stay out of this nonsense, and then they don't do it. So he's staying really, really consistent. But he also has like an end goal that he mentioned way back there in that very first 2 verses we read, where he says that one day it's going to be perfect. One day, the king, the real king, is going to rule over everything.
One day.
One day. All right, so last section. Who would like to read? Jane, have you read yet?
Yeah, didn't he read the first section? No, Alex read the
Al read first. I remember you reading. So which one of you read the other one?
I read it.
You read the other. So Jane's turn. Go for it, Jane. You get to finish chapter 11. Start at verse 4. No. You've lost budding and privileges.
Shut up. This is what the Lord my God says. Go and care for the flock this is headed for slaughter. The buyers slaughtered their sheep with sour bush. The sellers say, praise the Lord. Now I'm rich. Even the shepherds have no compassion for me. Likewise, I will no longer have pity on the people of the land, says the Lord. I will let them fall into each other's hands and into the hands of their king. They will turn the land into wilderness and will not rescue them. So I cared for the flock intended for slaughter. The flock was oppressed. Then I took 2 separate staffs and named one favor, and the other one union. I got rid of their 3 shepherds and a single one. But I became impatient with the sheep, and they hated me too. So I told them, I won't be your shepherd any longer if you die. If you are killed, you are killed. Let those who remain devour each other. And then I took my staff called favor to show that I had revoked the covenant I had made with all the nations. That was the end of my covenant with them. The separated flock was watching me. They knew that the Lord was speaking through my actions. I said to them, if you like me, give me my wages, whatever I'm worth, but only if you want to. So they gave me my wages, 30 pieces of silver. The Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, this magnificent sum at which they valued me. So I took the 30 payment coins and threw them to the potter in the temple of the Lord. Then I took my other staff with me and said, showing the bond of my unity between Judah and Israel broken. Then the Lord said to me, go and again pay the part of the worthless shepherd. This illustrates how I'll give this nation a shepherd who will not care for those who die. Not look out for the young nor heal the injured, nor feed the healthy. Instead, the shepherd will eat the meat of the fattest sheep and tear off their clothes. What sorrow awaits this worthless shepherd who abandons the flocks? The sword will cut his arm and pierce his right eye. His arms will become useless and his right eye completely blind.
Oh. All right, now this section sounds pretty weird on the surface, but when you start to understand the grammar of it, it gets weirder, even weirder. So go back to the very first part that Jaden read, verse 4. It says, "This is what the Lord God says." Then you get a quote, and it ends down there at the end of verse 6. Then it starts up in verse 7, and it's the author, Zechariah, talking to you, the reader. So God said, go do a thing, and then Zechariah tells you how it went. So what did God tell him to do? God says, go pretend to be a shepherd. Now, if you're paying attention to the whole book, you know whenever God says go do a thing, he literally tells Zechariah, go stand at the temple building site where like the temple's supposed to go up, and I want you to go publicly address the entire city of Jerusalem, all these people that are starting to rebuild things, and I want you to go tell them something. This time he says, I want you to go play make-believe. I want you to go be a shepherd. Now in the middle of Jerusalem, as they're rebuilding, there's not going to be a whole bunch of real sheep just hanging out in the center of the city. It's not realistic. So when he says, go pretend to be a shepherd, like, he's going to have to pantomime this. He's going to have to, like, do make-believe out in front of everyone, grown man. And he brings 2 staves, and in his pantomime, he means his stabs. He says this one is favor and this one is union.
I do that a lot too.
It's a pretty weird thing. And like as he's acting it out, he says this little line. He says,
It says it somewhere in between verse 11 and 12.
Yeah, actually you're right. Middle of 11, he says the suffering flock was watching me. So literally, he's saying, oh, come on, guys.
3.14. Do you know what pi is? 3.14.
Oh.
Just like March 10th is Mario Day.
Really?
I know, that was so cool because if you take the letters and you switch them up, it spells Mario.
10. Mario.
No way! I should get the Mario letters.
Yeah, Jacob can.
I did it. Wait, we should have had church on that day. Just imagine if that was church on that day. And we all just.
Yeah, I was gonna say it was Sunday. Me and Alexis were there with Jacob and Liam.
Shit, that was the one I missed because I was at my mom's. Dang it!
Your mom planned it. She knew you'd be happy.
It's okay. First service was so slim that Zelda beat Mario. So it's just, it is what it is.
Wait, who did Mario?
Some kids who don't really play Smash that much. And Zelda was Mandy. She doesn't play that much either. There's 3 kids for a service. That's my point. You don't come for a service. You
No, I do come for.
not really. Not really.
I mean,
You're mostly second service.
I come really early on second service, so I see everyone.
No, Mandy literally will walk out if I'm in the middle of teaching or in the middle of praying if it's the time to end. You will never see her if you're early. You have to be here during service because she will walk out at precisely 10:30 every single Sunday.
Wow.
Like it's like a standing rule between her and her parents. Like you can't stay past 10:30. Doesn't matter what's happening.
Just leave the service.
Like they probably, I don't know. I've never asked that question.
No, she just leaves.
They probably do.
She drives herself.
She leaves. She goes to the car and just waits.
She's
for her
in the
parents
car.
to get out.
Someone walks by and she looks at the piece and like
10:32. She's there. Okay, so.
And then she looks at her watch when they get in
walk
the
through this
car.
with me, guys. He says he's acting all this out, and the sheep who are suffering watch this, hear this, they get it. And the leaders in this analogy are called the shepherds, and the people of Jerusalem that have bad leaders, they're called the sheep, the suffering sheep. So he then takes the favor stick and he breaks it, and they have to watch this, like the favor of God, gone. God is no longer going to favor the other nations.
I break the favor stick all the time.
All right, then he goes on and he has to break the union stick. Now, again, this is supposed to be symbolic. he is acting out the part of a good shepherd. Later, he acts out the part of a bad shepherd. So the question is he talking about right there, that moment, he, a shepherd of his people, a leader, and right there, that moment, they, the other priests who weren't leading well, are they the bad shepherds? Or does the good shepherd and the bad shepherd symbolize something else? Is it right there, right then? Or is it something else? He feels like it's the future. Any way you could get a hint?
I feel like this is gonna break everything that's been happening, and now it's gonna be a present.
I would say
It didn't break. It was present before.
reads like a present.
Well, it
Reads
had a
like
little
the
bit of
present?
present.
Okay. All right, think about this. The buyers slaughter their sheep without remorse. The sellers say, praise the Lord, now I'm rich. Literally meaning that the people in charge of the people, so the leaders, are getting rich off of the normal people, and then they're praising God. God has made me rich by abusing the regular people.
Sounds like.
So they're giving God the credit for
Like these
horrible
guys are
behavior.
smart.
Does that sound like any point in history?
Yeah.
Theirs or another?
Is that the
Hundreds
is
and-
that the case?
Well, there's and
There's what?
there's and
And also now. Okay.
Is
Okay.
that the Greek you were talking about earlier?
Okay. Not a bad guess.
Wait.
All right. Let's see if there's any more hints in here. Because this is how you literally interpret Bible prophecy. You guys are doing it right now. You look for the things that are fixed in interpretation, and you try and figure out where, when is he talking about.
It's really creepy how quiet
Here's
this
one.
is.
They're doing good. They're trying to let you guys think. Okay, guys, try this one on for size. Verse 13. And the Lord said to me, throw to the potter this magnificent sum at which they valued me. So I took the 30 coins and threw them to the potter in the temple of the Lord. Anyone know what that's referring to?
Well, I mean, that's what. Yeah, Jesus flipped the tables when
Okay.
they were doing
What are you
that stuff.
thinking
I just remember something about Jesus.
That's
and
what he
the
did.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. You're talking about what I'm talking
No?
about.
Okay.
He's sharing the
All right,
thoughts.
so the valuing of someone at 30 pieces of silver has only one other reference in history that we know of.
Oh,
And it's-
not Judah. It's the guy who turns Jesus in. He gets 30 silver coins.
Judas.
Judas is paid in 30 silver
Oh
coins.
yeah.
And when
So
after he turns in Jesus and Jesus gets arrested,
Oh,
he feels
I
remorse.
he's the one
swear.
that sells all the
Your
sheep.
mom's gonna.
No sheep.
Oh,
No sheep.
like in a sense.
Oh,
Like, he's
no,
supposed
the
to be-
shepherd. It's the good shepherd. Check this out, guys. Check out what the silver is in the picture. Listen, guys. He says, verse 12, if you like, give me my wages. This is the good shepherd talking to the sheep, which is a weird thing if it's not an analogy, right? So the good shepherd's talking to the sheep. Give me my wages, if you like, whatever I'm worth, but only if you want to. So they counted out for my wages 30 pieces of silver, and the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter.
That's because it wasn't his actual worth. Those
That was,
sickos.
do you get the sarcasm that comes up in the next phrase? Look at this magnificent sum at which they valued me. Sarcasm.
I'm not like.
So check it out. Jesus,
These
the only other
idiots.
person we know of in history that was valued at 30 pieces of silver publicly. And then, this is the best part, after Judas feels remorse, he goes back to the temple and he throws the money at the priest, says,
Yeah, this is exactly.
don't want it. We've made a mistake. Blah,
Don't
blah, blah, blah,
want
blah.
it. Don't
The
need
priests,
it.
in their ridiculous self-righteousness, look at the silver in the bag and go, we can't put this back in the church, like, bank account, the church coffers, they called it, because it's blood money. Like, they recognized that they bought Jesus' death with that money. They recognized that it was blood money, but they wouldn't admit that they paid to have a guy killed. Like,
The money paid for the guy to be killed.
it's the money's fault,
Yeah.
not our fault. So they're like, we can't put this in the coffer. It's blood money. That would be
Let's
wrong.
just buy a
It
field.
would be wrong to put this in our account. It wouldn't be
Let's
wrong
buy
to pay
some
for a guy to
slaves.
die, but it'd be wrong to put it in our account. So they decide they have to do something with it.
So buy a field and bury bodies in it.
But what field?
A shepherd.
It said
Sheep grazing field.
No.
no. It was like
telling
it
you.
was like an abandoned field that was like considered haunted, wasn't
It
it?
was the potter's field. It was literally a field where
Dad's
people went and took their pots that didn't turn out right, they took their pots that broke, they took the pots that they couldn't get to fire properly, and they just chucked them, and they'd fall in the soil, and the soil would break the clay down, and it would just turn into regular soil. And then you'd go back there as a potter, and you could collect soil and use that clay soil to go make new pots. So
That's
literally,
beautiful.
right here, he says, take that dirty money and
That's
go
a gift
give
from
it to the
Dirty,
potters.
get it dirty?
Go give it to the
because they
potters.
throw it in the dirt. You get
Yeah.
it? Isn't
Yeah.
it funny?
I got it.
Jesus has like
I got
5 tons going at once.
Okay, then this last
Give it a
prophecy,
roast.
he says, break the stick that's called union, symbolizing that Israel and Judah are split. Now this is strange because at this point in history, they got their land back. They got back the south, but the north was quasi theirs. Because they weren't allowed to have a king, because they weren't allowed to have a government of their own, they're still under the Persian government, they couldn't go up to the north and just be like, it's ours now, because there was people living there. That was the catch. There was people living up north called the Samaritans. And the Samaritans lived there, and the Jews wanted the land back. That northern part was the part called Israel all through like the time after Solomon. And so they got Judah, that was theirs fair and square, they got their land back, they got to live there. But Samaria, they couldn't quite take back because they had no legal right to go kill the Samaritans, they had no legal right to go kick them out. But they were told by Persia, you can go back to your land. So like, well, we want it back, but we can't. Like, we'd be murderers to take it. So they just held a grudge against the Samaritans forever.
I know.
And then in Jesus' time, there's this crazy split between the south called Judah, the north-ish called Samaria, and then the way north called Galilee. The Galileans were looked at as like, you know, hicks, you know, rednecks. They were looked at as small town crazy people. The Samaritans were looked at as like, you're not really Jews, you're like half Jews, you're not complete part of our country, you're fakes. And then Judah thought of themselves as like the only real Israelites. Like we're the actual Israelites. So what this shows us is this walk through their future. That like the real deal good shepherd shows up, and they're like, all you're worth is like 30 pieces of silver. And that just goes to the potters anyways. And as a consequence, they're left in a broken state, where none of the other countries are not going to be blessed by Israel, they're going to be blessed some other way. Where the country's not going to get unified, they're going to stay split up. And then the final consequence of their rejection of the good shepherd, they get a bad shepherd instead. Now again, you can apply this in small ways to different people, but the things he says about this bad shepherd don't really match up unless you apply it to the Antichrist all the way down the line. That's the real like perfect fit for these prophecies. And so what you've got here is you've got the Christ and the Antichrist laid out as the good shepherd and then the bad shepherd. And that's it for today.
I'll close us in prayer.
Do I trust you?
Yes, you do.
You're gonna do it?
Yes.
Okay, can you ask people if they have any prayer requests?
No.
Well,
Okay. Bryce, do you have a prayer request or you don't? Okay. Alex, do you have one? Daniel?
Yeah, I got like a lot of work to do, and I gotta like work with Emily to clean our house by Monday. Our landlord's gonna come walk through and like check it out and see if we're taking good care of it. So it's kind of like when your parents come over and see if you're, you know, like come in your room and see if you actually clean your room.
Dude, I love it. My parents never could have. The other day, my mom did, and she got so mad. She took all my stuff to put it at the old pile.
Yeah, okay,
like,
so this is where we're at. We're like, parents about to come in and check in on our room and see how we did.
When
So,
she saw it, she like,
Monday is a big day.
Filed everything.
Okay.
It was terrible.
Anybody else?
No. No, I'm good.
We can pray for Alex to actually have a clean room.
Oh, no, it's beautiful
More
right
sleep.
now. I
Okay,
haven't
Father,
for 3 days.
we come to you today.
Jeremiah needs sleep too.
Just you, why did you come here?
Ouch! I'm glad. I for one am glad that Jeremiah took all of his busy, tiring week to be here.
Okay, we're just gonna go in prayer before
Nathan,
this gets any
it doesn't
worse.
matter what you do.
We're gonna
Like,
go
there's
in prayer
nothing.
before it gets any worse.
Gene, do you have anything you can pray for?
I mean, my stomach hurts like really bad. I seem to go to the bathroom a lot.
Okay.
That's fair. That's fair.
Heavenly
Have you
Father,
had ginger ale?
Yeah, I love ginger ale.
Ginger ale helps. So she gets some.
Heavenly Father, we want to pray for Katie's tongue mom, that it would feel better. And we pray for Alex to clean his room so that he isn't disrespecting his elders like his parents, because you know that is one of the things that you tell us to do in the Bible, and you know it's wrong to do that. And to sin to do that. You need to repent for doing that person who is depressed. And I just want to pray that everyone gets some sleep because he's had a long, rough, tiring week. I don't know about rough, but tiring, obviously. And for Daniel, that you can give him the ability to clean fast, so that he can get his house cleaned up before Monday, so that he can also get all the other work done on the house, so that he's not all stressed when he packs up. In his name, amen. Amen.
Did you pray for Jeremiah?
Yeah,
Yeah,
and then he gets
I think I got like everything was switched besides mine.
I wanted to make sure that
Do
she
you
did
feel like
what
that
she
was
did.
a mistake?
I don't
Or by
really feel like me right now.
I like you said my
Like white glove.
You should do what you
Oh
do.
yeah, all your
White
stuff's in a
glove.
bag.
Do it if
No,
you're
it's beautiful right now.
Yeah.
Am I still the only one?
I go third.
Dude, I literally have to clean it for 2 weeks.
But she was so hot. I thought